The small town of St. Bernard, Louisiana, was like a photograph from another time. Quiet streets lined with moss-draped oaks, neighbors who waved as they passed, and a slower rhythm to life that seemed impervious to the world outside. But on the morning of September 14th, 1992, a single moment would forever change the town's pulse, leaving behind only questions. Sarah Langston was 19 years old, with a smile that lit up the diner where she worked as a waitress. Her blonde hair was usually pulled back in a messy ponytail, her uniform a simple apron and a pair of worn-out shoes. She had dreams, a love for old movies, a soft spot for classic rock, and an ambition to leave St. Bernard, to go somewhere bigger, where she could finally escape the shadow of the small town where everyone knew your name, and every mistake was remembered. Today, we uncover secrets that have haunted this town for far too long. But before we dive deeper into Sarah's disappearance, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and let's see how far this mystery reaches. That morning, Sarah kissed her mother, Jeanette, goodbye as she left for her shift at the local diner. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of weather that promised nothing but a dreary day. Jeanette, still in her bathrobe, waved her off from the porch, the usual warmth in her smile. "Be safe, honey. See you soon," she called out, but Sarah didn't turn around. The next time Jeanette saw her daughter, Sarah's car was parked on the shoulder of a lonely road, just a mile from the diner. The engine was still running. The doors were wide open, the driver's seat empty, and her purse was resting in the passenger seat. A strange, unsettling stillness clung to the scene. The sheriff's office was quick to label it a simple missing persons case. They'd seen it before, they said. A runaway, perhaps, or a teenager who just wanted to get away for a while. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. But as the hours stretched into days, something in the air of St. Bernard shifted. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy, like a storm just waiting to break. Jeanette couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A mother always knows when something's off. She'd raised Sarah on her own, after her husband left when Sarah was just a baby. The two of them had always been close. Sarah was her world, her heart. And now, that heart was missing, torn out by something Jeanette couldn't understand. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon on that first night, Jeanette was pacing in the living room, eyes flicking to the door every time a car passed outside. She waited for Sarah to walk through that door, or at least for the phone to ring. But neither came. As the days wore on, the dread in the community grew. The diner, usually bustling with locals enjoying coffee and gossip, sat eerily silent. People whispered, casting sideways glances at each other. Had someone seen something? Did someone know more than they were saying? Jeanette tried to stay strong, leaning on the support of friends and neighbors, but the fear in her chest was growing. She knew her daughter too well. Sarah wouldn't have just left. Not like this. Not without a word. No, something had happened, something bad. But what? The sheriff's office worked through the night, following leads that led nowhere. Sarah's friends were questioned, but none of them had any real answers. There were no ransom notes, no phone calls demanding money. Nothing seemed to make sense. Then, just when Jeanette thought she might lose her mind to the waiting, her phone rang. The sound of the phone in the dead silence of the house felt foreign, like an omen. Jeanette rushed to it, her hands shaking as she lifted the receiver. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jeanette, it's me. Sarah." "She called me earlier," came the voice on the other end, thick with the emotion of someone who had been crying for days. It was Sarah's best friend, Lily, her voice breaking through the line. "What did she say?" Jeanette's voice was tight, every word hanging like a lifeline. Lily's voice faltered, and for a moment, there was only the sound of shallow breathing on the other end. She said she was scared. She sounded strange. I didn't think much of it. But now, oh God, Jeanette, she said she thought someone was watching her. The world around Jeanette seemed to pause, the weight of Lily's words sinking in slowly, painfully. Who, Lily? Who was watching her? Jeanette's heart began to race, a cold sweat forming on her skin. "I don't know," Lily whispered. "But," she said, she needed to leave town. She said she was going to meet someone. She didn't say who. Jeanette's stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple runaway. Sarah had been scared. There was more to this than anyone had realized. And just like that, The phone went silent. The line went dead. A cruel, final click. Jeanette sat in the dark room, the receiver still pressed to her ear. Her daughter had been scared. The voice of her best friend, trembling in terror, was now the only connection to Sarah that remained. The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. Was Sarah still alive? Where was she? Who had been watching her? And why had Sarah's last call been filled with fear? The only thing Jeanette knew for certain was that whatever was happening, it wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. The clock was ticking, and time was running out. The town of St. Bernard had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The town square, with its brick buildings and small cafes, was the heartbeat of the community. People didn't lock their doors, and kids played until the sun set, their laughter filling the air. But after Sarah Langston's disappearance, everything changed. A cloud of uncertainty settled over the town, and the once warm, familiar streets felt colder, darker. In the days that followed Sarah's vanishing, the residents of St. Bernard rallied together. They organized search parties, combing through the dense woods that surrounded the town, the same woods they'd once walked through without a second thought. Local volunteers posted missing person flyers on every street corner, hoping for a glimpse of Sarah or a sign that would lead them to her. Jeanette, grief-stricken but determined, joined the search every day, her face drawn and pale, her eyes clouded with worry. She walked the same route Sarah had taken that morning, retracing her daughter's steps with a quiet desperation, as if she could somehow find a clue by sheer force of will. The sheriff's department, led by a tired but dedicated team, did their best to coordinate the efforts, but the search had already grown vast and unruly. The town had never seen anything like this before. The community, once unified in the face of small-town troubles, was now divided by fear. Theories began to swirl. Had Sarah run off with someone? Was she kidnapped? Or had something darker happened? Something that lurked just beyond the town's peaceful surface? Detective Warren Jackson was the man who was now leading the investigation. With over 20 years of experience in law enforcement, he had seen his share of tragic cases, but something about Sarah's disappearance nagged at him. The town was too small for this kind of thing. Everyone knew Sarah. She wasn't the type to vanish without a word. As he studied the case file, the inconsistencies began to gnaw at him. Jackson wasn't one to jump to conclusions. He had seen too many false leads, too many cases that had seemed clear-cut only to unravel. But there was something off about Sarah's disappearance. The car's position, the fact that the engine was still running, the open door, the purse placed neatly on the passenger seat. None of it made sense. If Sarah had just disappeared, why would she leave her things behind in such an orderly fashion? And why, when her phone was turned off, had she not contacted anyone, not even her best friend Lily, with whom she spoke every day? It was these small details that pushed Jackson to dig deeper. Was this a case of a runaway, as the initial report suggested? Or was there something more sinister at play? Jackson wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this case become another statistic in a small town that had long since stopped asking questions. Despite the growing pressure, Jackson remained calm and focused. His reputation for being empathetic toward victims, without letting his emotions cloud his judgment, had earned him respect throughout the department. He knew how to balance the human side of the job with the cold, analytical approach it required. But this case, with its mounting questions and tight-knit community, was different. As Jackson began reviewing the evidence, he noted the most disturbing detail: Sarah's purse and keys. They were placed neatly on the front seat of her car. It didn't match the frantic disappearance of a teenager who'd been abducted or a young woman fleeing an abusive relationship. This was someone who had been, for a brief moment, calm, too calm for someone in her position. Jeanette, meanwhile, was spiraling. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who had been so full of life just days ago, could simply vanish. Each day, she walked around town asking questions, hoping for answers, but people's eyes were filled with sympathy, not knowledge. The pain in her chest deepened with every unanswered call, every missed opportunity to find Sarah. One morning, as the sun rose over the bayou and the air was still damp with fog, a phone call came in to the sheriff's office. A witness had seen something. It was vague, but it was something. The woman, a local resident named Janet Cooper. had been walking her dog early the previous morning when she noticed a figure standing near Sarah's car, hidden in the shadows of the nearby tree line. She couldn't make out details, just a tall, thin man wearing a dark hoodie, his face obscured. Janet couldn't tell if the person was involved in Sarah's disappearance, but she had a bad feeling. Her instinct told her something wasn't right, and it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prompt Jackson to follow up. After all, in cases like this, any lead, no matter how small, was worth pursuing. As Jackson listened to the report, his eyes narrowed, a mixture of caution and curiosity in his gaze. He jotted down a few notes, making a mental note to check out the area Janet had described. Was this the break they'd been waiting for? Or was it just another dead end? But there was something about the vague description that didn't sit right with Jackson. How had Janet only seen a figure, but no details? Was this a memory clouded by the passage of time, or was it something more deliberate? Something someone wanted to hide? As he stood by his desk, Jackson's mind raced with the possibilities. The clock was ticking, and with each passing hour, the chance of finding Sarah alive grew slimmer. Yet, there was a flicker of hope, just a flicker, that the answers were out there. Somewhere in the shadows, someone knew the truth, and Jackson was determined to find them. Jackson's phone buzzed on his desk. A call from the forensics team. The results were in from the examination of Sarah's car. The new evidence they found was chilling. Tommy Turner had always been a quiet presence in St. Bernard. At 22, he had the kind of stillness that made people uncertain of what was going on behind his eyes. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was the type to keep to himself, his emotions carefully guarded. With dark, shaggy hair and a slim, tall frame, he often appeared more distant than he actually was. But in the small town, where gossip ran as freely as the Mississippi River, everyone knew that Tommy had once been Sarah Langston's boyfriend. And when Sarah disappeared, Tommy's name quickly moved to the top of the list of suspects. Sarah had ended things with Tommy a few months before she vanished. They'd been high school sweethearts, the kind of couple everyone expected to last. But their relationship had fizzled out. Sarah had changed in ways Tommy didn't fully understand. She'd started talking about moving away, about finding something more than St. Bernard had to offer. It had been a tough breakup for Tommy, one that left him reeling. He'd been emotional about it, as anyone would be, but it wasn't the kind of grief that would raise alarms. At least, not until she disappeared. Tommy had been at a bar the night before Sarah vanished, nursing a few beers and talking to some friends. He'd said that he'd been alone that morning when he found out Sarah was missing. But as the investigation unfolded, cracks began to appear in his alibi. His friends had seen him leave the bar earlier than he'd admitted, and his whereabouts in the hours after Sarah's disappearance were unclear. It wasn't enough to charge him, but it was enough to make Detective Warren Jackson raise an eyebrow. Over the next few days, Tommy was interviewed multiple times by the police. His grief seemed genuine, almost to the point of being too genuine. He wept openly, but there was something in his eyes that didn't quite match the tears, a deep sadness, yes, but also a flicker of something harder to place, something like guilt. When he spoke about Sarah, it was always in the past tense. He described their relationship as if it had ended years ago, even though it had only been a few months. The first interview was filled with long pauses as Tommy tried to remember details, his voice trembling when he spoke of Sarah's smile, her laugh, the way she'd made him feel alive. But there was also something off. When the police asked him if he had seen Sarah the morning she disappeared, his answer was firm. No, I didn't see her. I didn't know anything was wrong. Jackson wasn't sure if he believed him. Tommy's life before the breakup had been a patchwork of ups and downs, but nothing too unusual for a young man growing up in a small town. He had no criminal record, no signs of violent behavior. But as Jackson dug deeper, he discovered Tommy's emotional history wasn't as simple as it appeared. After the breakup, Tommy had been visibly distraught. He stopped hanging out with friends as often, spending more time by himself, often driving aimlessly at night. People around town had noticed his increasingly erratic behavior. He seemed more withdrawn, more isolated. His family life, too, was complicated. Tommy's father had left when he was young, and he and his mother never got along well. He'd grown up with his aunt and uncle after that, but the lack of a solid home foundation had left its mark on him. Tommy was emotionally adrift, struggling to find direction. In the months following the breakup, he'd started picking up odd jobs, some cleaning at the local gas station, sometimes helping out with odd repair work at the hardware store. But he wasn't saving up for anything. His life felt aimless. That's when Jackson started to wonder, could Tommy have been capable of something darker? The deeper Jackson dug, the more questions piled up. When he cross-referenced Tommy's phone records, he found something troubling. Tommy had been in contact with Sarah the night before she vanished. The texts they exchanged seemed innocuous enough, just a few words about the things Sarah was planning for the next day. But there was a tension in the conversation, something unspoken, like Sarah was trying to avoid saying something important. Jackson went over the details with a fine-tooth comb. The most telling moment came when Jackson visited the diner where Sarah worked. The owner, a woman named Betty, mentioned that Tommy had come by the day before Sarah's disappearance, looking for her. He had seemed off, she said, as though he was trying to hide his true intentions. She didn't know what Tommy wanted, but the fact that he had been looking for Sarah when she was supposed to be working and hadn't shown up for their shift together raised a few more red flags. Then came the crucial detail. Sarah's best friend, Lily, had confirmed that Tommy had been the last person to see Sarah before she left for her shift that morning. Lily had called her just before Sarah left the house, and Sarah had confirmed she was on her way to work. No one had seen her leave the house, but Tommy's statement contradicted that. The investigation started taking its toll on Tommy. The stress of the interviews and the accusations slowly wore him down, leaving him emotionally fragile. He started showing up at the memorial services for Sarah, always in the back, his eyes red and puffy from crying. At the most recent service, Jackson observed him carefully from a distance. Tommy stood alone by the candlelit table, his face twisted in anguish. He was sweating, his hands shaking, his eyes darting nervously as if he were looking for something, or someone. When the service ended and the crowd began to disperse, Tommy's tears suddenly turned into sobs. He broke down in front of everyone, his body heaving with emotion, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he screamed into the night. "I never wanted this to happen. I never." It was a scene that struck Jackson to the core. Was Tommy truly innocent, racked with grief over a lost love? Or was his breakdown the final, desperate act of a man who feared his secret would come to light? The audience was left to question Tommy's innocence. Jackson, too, was uncertain. Was he seeing the remorse of an innocent man, or the guilt of someone who knew far more than he was letting on? Tommy's breakdown at the memorial service raised new questions. Was this the true face of a grieving ex-boyfriend, or a man hiding something darker? Jackson knew there was more to this case than met the eye, and the deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became. This is just the beginning. If you want to stay up to date on the shocking twists and real-life mysteries we uncover, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on. You won't want to miss what's coming next. 2 years had passed since Sarah Langston vanished, and the small town of St. Bernard had slowly returned to its routine. The flowers on the street corners wilted, the memorials faded, and the whispers of Sarah's disappearance grew quieter with each passing month. People had moved on, as people do in small towns where life's harshest truths are often buried beneath the surface. But for those who truly knew Sarah, the absence was an ache that wouldn't go away. Jeanette Langston's life had become a routine of grief. She had clung to the hope that one day, someone would walk through her door and tell her where Sarah was. But with every day that passed, that hope diminished. Her house, once a lively place filled with Sarah's laughter and energy, now felt like a tomb. The kitchen table, where they used to sit together, had become a relic of what could have been, littered with the same half-finished projects that Sarah had left behind. Jeanette hadn't touched her daughter's room, but she'd spent countless hours standing in the doorway, staring at the empty bed, as if waiting for Sarah to come back. Jeanette was no longer the same woman she had been. She was thin, her face gaunt, and the brightness that had once shone in her eyes had been replaced with a quiet emptiness. She'd stopped going to church, stopped socializing with neighbors. The few friends she had left tried to offer their support, but they didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't lost a child. They hadn't spent the last 2 years hoping for a phone call that never came. The police, too, had moved on. Detective Warren Jackson, the one man who seemed to understand the depth of her pain, had become a distant figure. 2 years ago, he'd been the one who held out hope, the one who assured her they would find Sarah. But now he was sidelined. No new leads. No new evidence. No answers. Every now and then, Jeanette would hear a rumor, or someone would mention a potential lead, but nothing ever came of it. Sarah's case had officially gone cold. Jackson had tried to keep her updated, but his visits were becoming fewer and further between. There were no breakthroughs. No new suspects. The case, once the heart of St. Bernard's concerns, had fallen to the back of everyone's mind. Jeanette couldn't let go, though. She couldn't walk away from her daughter's memory, no matter how much time passed. She had become obsessed with finding answers, even if it meant digging through the remains of a life that should have been. Every night, Jeanette pored over old photographs of Sarah, every old letter, every school project, trying to find something she had missed. She could not allow herself to believe that Sarah had simply vanished into thin air. Something had happened. Someone knew something. It wasn't just the mystery of Sarah's disappearance that haunted Jeanette. It was the feeling of betrayal. The police had promised they were doing everything they could, but the lack of results left Jeanette questioning everything. The fact that no one had found anything in 2 years felt like an abandonment. She felt as though the investigation had been put to rest long before she was ready to let go. But she couldn't. She couldn't stop. Not when every waking hour was filled with the gnawing sensation that she was so close to something, to the truth. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through a box of old keepsakes in the attic, Jeanette came across something she had nearly forgotten about: a photograph of Sarah and Tommy Turner. They had been at a high school dance together, young, happy, carefree. Tommy's arm was draped around Sarah's shoulder, his smile wide and unguarded. It was a moment of innocence, a time before everything had gone wrong. As Jeanette gazed at the photograph, something in the background caught her eye. It was blurry at first, a figure standing in the corner of the photo, almost out of focus. A man she didn't recognize. He was barely visible, but Jeanette was sure it wasn't anyone she had seen in the town before. He wasn't part of their group, not someone she could recall. But why had she never noticed him before? She stared at the image for what seemed like hours, a chill creeping up her spine. Who was he? And why had he been there? Jeanette felt a sick sense of dread settle in her stomach. She quickly shoved the photograph back into the box, as if trying to rid herself of the feeling it had given her. She had spent so much time looking for answers, but now she had a new question to add to the pile. It was only when she started going through Sarah's things, sorting through drawers and boxes for any new clues, that Jeanette found something else: a receipt, tucked carefully between the pages of one of Sarah's old books. The receipt was from a local bar in town, dated the night Sarah disappeared. Her hands trembled as she read the details. A tab for 2 drinks, both ordered just before midnight. The name at the top of the receipt was familiar: the Bayou Bar, a place Sarah had never mentioned going to. The night Sarah vanished, she had been at work, or so Jeanette thought. Had Sarah gone out after her shift? And if so, why hadn't she mentioned it? Jeanette felt a rush of panic. Her eyes scanned the receipt again, her heart racing. The receipt held no answers, only more questions. What had Sarah been doing at the bar? Who had she been with? The phone rang just as she was about to set the receipt down, but Jeanette barely noticed it. Her hands were shaking too badly, her mind spinning. She had something that could lead to the answers she'd been desperately searching for. The case wasn't cold. Not yet. Jeanette's fingers hovered over the phone, torn between calling Detective Jackson or waiting until she had more information. The weight of the receipt, the photograph, and the mystery man, they were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't ignore anymore. There was something she was missing, and she wasn't going to let it slip away this time. It had been 11 years since Sarah Langston vanished from St. Bernard, Louisiana. The case, once the heart of the town's worries, had slipped into the quiet corners of history. The search efforts had dwindled. The initial stirrings of hope had turned to bitter resignation. But in 2003, as the small town braced for another ordinary year, a new piece of the puzzle was quietly dropped into Detective Warren Jackson's lap. Mark Colson, a mechanic who had lived in St. Bernard for most of his life, had always been the kind of man who kept to himself. He wasn't one for gossip or attention. In fact, he was one of the quietest people in town, often seen working on cars in his shop or sitting in the corner of a local bar, nursing a drink. But on one late evening in March, over a half-empty bottle of bourbon, Mark casually let something slip that would reignite the cold case. "I don't know if I should say this," Mark had mumbled, slurring slightly as he leaned in toward his friend on the bar stool. "But Tommy. He told me everything, you know. The night Sarah disappeared, he confessed. Said he did something stupid. Couldn't take it back." The words were barely heard over the clinking of glasses, but to Mark's friend, it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. He didn't say much in response, but he knew, just as Mark did, that this wasn't something to be ignored. It wasn't just idle chatter. The next day, the confession from Mark made its way to Detective Jackson. Jackson had never let go of the case completely. Even after so many years of silence, there was always a nagging feeling that something was wrong. So when the news about Mark's revelation reached him, he took the tip seriously. Tommy Turner, once the prime suspect, had faded from view. His life had moved on, as had the rest of the town. But now, Jackson had to reconsider everything. Tommy's confession, if it were true, could change everything. He started by visiting Mark Coulson at his mechanic shop, a small building tucked between two aging houses on the edge of town. The sun hung low in the sky as Jackson walked up to the shop, its peeling sign swaying gently in the breeze. The air smelled of oil and grease, and the buzz of an old fan in the corner did little to break the thick silence of the place. Mark was elbow-deep in an engine when Jackson arrived. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his face fell. "Detective Jackson," Mark greeted, his voice thick with unease. "What can I do for you?" "I heard you had something to say about Tommy Turner," Jackson said, getting straight to the point. Mark wiped his hands on a rag, the movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at the engine in front of him, as if searching for the right words, then sighed. "I didn't mean for it to come out like this. I was drunk that night. But I'm telling you, he confessed to me. Said he couldn't live with himself." "What exactly did he say?" Jackson pressed. Mark shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "Not much. He was real messed up, crying. I didn't know what to think at the time. But now, I don't know, Detective. I think he knew what he'd done." Jackson nodded, absorbing the information. Mark's drunken confession didn't offer much to go on, but it reignited something deep within him. He wasn't about to dismiss the possibility that Tommy had been involved. Maybe, just maybe, the small-town mechanic had seen something that everyone else had missed. As Jackson dug deeper into Tommy's life, the town of St. Bernard grew uneasy. Tommy had always been seen as a victim of circumstances, a troubled young man who had lost the love of his life, whose grief had been too much to bear. But now, with Mark's statement, the town was divided. Some of the old friends who had once vouched for Tommy's innocence began to question everything. Others clung to the belief that Tommy was incapable of such a thing, unwilling to accept the new possibility. Rumors spread quickly through the town. Tommy was always a little off, you know. People whispered in the local cafes. But to do something like that, I don't know. Seems like Mark's just trying to stir up trouble. Detective Jackson, however, wasn't swayed by the gossip. He went to see Tommy again, this time in a more formal setting. The interview room was cold, the walls bare. Tommy sat across from Jackson, his face gaunt, his eyes filled with a kind of weary resignation. "Mark Coulson told me you confessed to him," Jackson said quietly, watching Tommy carefully. Tommy's face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't confess anything." Jackson leaned in, his gaze unyielding. "You were the last person to see Sarah before she left that morning. You've said that before, but now Mark is telling me something different." Tommy's eyes shifted, and for a brief moment, the mask cracked. I don't know. I didn't do anything. I swear, I didn't hurt her," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. Jackson let the silence stretch, watching Tommy carefully. He could see the strain in Tommy's face, the sweat on his brow. It was clear that the weight of the past was taking its toll. "I want to believe you, Tommy," Jackson said softly, "but I need you to be honest with me." As Jackson left the interview room, he felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over him. Tommy's reaction wasn't what he expected. The denial, the fear, they could all be signs of guilt, or they could be the panic of an innocent man cornered by years of unanswered questions. But as Jackson walked back to his car, something else lingered in his mind. He had been reviewing old evidence in his office when he found an old letter, one that Sarah had written just days before she vanished. It was a short note, but there was something in it that made Jackson pause. Sarah had written to a friend, but it was the last sentence that caught Jackson's eye. "I think Tommy knows more than he's letting on." Jackson stood still in the parking lot, the letter clenched in his hand. A knot formed in his stomach. Had Sarah known something about Tommy all along? Or had she simply been afraid of him? Whatever the truth was, Jackson was certain of one thing. There was still more to uncover, and he wasn't done with this case yet. Not by a long shot. The days following the reopening of Sarah Langston's case had been filled with a sense of urgency and dread. Detective Warren Jackson had made it his mission to find answers, and now, with the new tip-off from Mark Colson and the increasing pressure from the community, he felt the weight of every passing hour. The clock had been ticking for over a decade, but Jackson knew that time was still on his side. It was late when Jackson stood in front of a stack of old evidence files. The worn boxes, labeled in fading ink, held the remnants of a case that had long gone cold. He had always felt a sense of guilt when he looked at those files, like he had let something slip through his fingers. There were details, clues that had once seemed insignificant, but now, with Tommy Turner's name back in the spotlight, those clues took on new meaning. The breakthrough came when Jackson re-examined the small scrap of fabric found near Sarah's car, the one item that had never been properly analyzed. For years, it had been dismissed as unimportant, nothing more than a bit of debris caught in the wind. But now, with the case reopened, Jackson sent the fabric back to the lab for testing. It was a hunch, a gut feeling that something had been overlooked. The lab results came back within days. The fabric, it turned out, matched a piece of clothing worn by Tommy Turner during a previous arrest. A small detail, seemingly insignificant, was now a crucial piece of the puzzle. Tommy's clothing had been torn in a struggle, but who had he been struggling with? What had happened that morning, just before Sarah vanished? Jackson's heart raced as the new DNA evidence was processed. The forensic team had found something far more shocking than anyone had anticipated. Not just a scrap of clothing, but Tommy's DNA was discovered on Sarah's clothing. It was conclusive. He had been at the scene of the crime. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The DNA confirmed it. Tommy Turner, despite his denials, had been directly involved in Sarah's disappearance. The case, once an enigma that had haunted the town for over a decade, was suddenly clear. Tommy had lied. He had been hiding something. The truth was now undeniable, written in the very cells of his own body. The arrest was swift. Tommy was taken in by the sheriff's department, his hands cuffed behind his back as he was escorted to the station. The town of St. Bernard was in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Tommy, the quiet, tortured ex-boyfriend, now stood accused of a crime that had torn apart the community. His face, pale and hollow, was plastered across the local news. The whispers began again, but this time, they were laced with betrayal. The questions began to pile up. Why had Tommy done it? What had driven him to such lengths? What was the nature of the relationship between him and Sarah that had ended so violently? But the case, though seemingly solved, felt incomplete. There were still too many gaps, too many things that didn't quite add up. Tommy's confession, when it came, would not be a clean one. He had been given a deal, but even then, he refused to speak. Instead, he remained silent, his eyes downcast as if he were trying to shield himself from the weight of what was to come. Jeanette Langston, Sarah's mother, was devastated. When she heard that Tommy had been arrested, a wave of emotion hit her. She had spent years believing that Tommy had been the victim of a tragic misunderstanding, that he had been just as lost as Sarah. Now, she had to face the gut-wrenching reality that the man she had once trusted had been involved in her daughter's death. But it wasn't just the pain of betrayal that consumed Jeanette. It was the emptiness that followed. Even with Tommy's arrest, there was no closure. Sarah was still gone. The hole in her heart remained, unfilled, despite the progress that had been made. Jeanette wasn't sure if she would ever be able to forgive Tommy, or herself, for letting the truth slip away for so long. The town was torn. Some people believed that Tommy had acted out of desperation, that his grief had consumed him, but others were furious. The revelation that Tommy had been involved in Sarah's death made them question everything they had once known about him. He had been their friend, their neighbor, and now he was a killer. The emotional divide within the community was palpable. Longtime friends turned on one another, whispering accusations in the streets. Some people even began to doubt the integrity of the investigation itself. Had they been wrong all along? Had the right person been arrested? Or was this just another mistake in a case filled with errors? Jackson, though weary, stood firm in his conviction. He knew Tommy was guilty. The evidence was irrefutable. But there was something unsettling about the whole situation. It felt too clean, too easy, as though the pieces had fallen into place too quickly. It was the evening before Tommy's trial, and Jackson was sitting in his office, going over the case file one last time. The stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll, but there was something gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. That's when he found it. A letter. Not just any letter. A letter written by Sarah herself. It had been tucked away in the back of one of her old journals, something that had never been flagged before. Jackson's hands trembled as he read the short, cryptic message. I think Tommy knows more than he's letting on. He's been acting strange, and I don't know what to do. If anything happens to me, promise you'll figure it out. Promise. The words hit Jackson hard. Sarah had known something. She had been afraid. The answer was right there, in black and white, but it raised more questions than it answered. What had Tommy been hiding? What had she discovered that had made her feel so threatened? As Jackson set the letter down, his phone buzzed. It was from the lab. There was a new lead. Carla Dunn's name had come up. Somehow, she was connected to the case, and Jackson had no idea just how deep the web of deceit truly went. Carla Dunn had always been a comforting presence in the Langston household. For years, she was a friend to Jeanette, a confidant who never once hesitated to offer her support. Carla, a woman in her early 40s, was the type of person who effortlessly blended into the background, steady, calm, and approachable. In the small town of St. Bernard, Carla was one of those people everyone knew and trusted, someone you could count on in a crisis. She had been a shoulder to lean on when Sarah went missing, a woman who shared in the grief and offered Jeanette comfort when the police couldn't provide answers. Her gentle smile and soft-spoken nature masked something darker, a secret that had festered for years, hidden beneath layers of friendship and community ties. The truth, however, was more complicated than anyone had realized, and it was Detective Warren Jackson who would eventually uncover it. Carla had grown up in St. Bernard and had always been a staple in the community. She ran a small floral shop on the edge of town, a quaint little store filled with the scent of fresh roses and lilies. Her life seemed simple, almost idyllic, but appearances can be deceiving. When Jackson began to dig deeper into her past, he uncovered a web of secrets that changed everything. The first clue came when Jackson began speaking to people who had known Carla long before Sarah's disappearance. One name kept coming up: Sarah's father, Greg Langston. Jeanette and Greg had been separated for years, their marriage falling apart long before Sarah's disappearance. Greg, a quiet man with a history of alcoholism, had long since disappeared from town. His absence, though painful for Jeanette, had never seemed suspicious. But as Jackson started piecing together old interviews and talking to people who knew both Carla and Greg, a troubling pattern emerged. Greg and Carla had been more than friends. In fact, they had been having an affair for months, a secret affair that, unbeknownst to Jeanette, had been the catalyst for many of the problems between her and Greg. This discovery turned everything upside down. Carla had never mentioned Greg to Jeanette, and certainly not in the way Jackson was now learning about. The affair had been kept hidden, not just from Jeanette, but from the entire community. And it was only when Sarah found out that things had started to spiral. Jackson's investigation revealed that Sarah had known about the affair. There were hints in her journal, little snippets of writing that hinted at the betrayal. She thinks I don't know. She thinks I won't tell Mom. Those words, scribbled hastily in Sarah's handwriting, suggested that she had planned to confront Carla about her relationship with her father, something that might have led to the fatal confrontation that had remained hidden for years. The more Jackson uncovered, the more sinister Carla's role became. On the night Sarah disappeared, Carla had told several people she was at home, reading a book, trying to unwind after a long day. But Jackson found discrepancies in her alibi. A local shopkeeper had seen Carla's car parked near the area where Sarah's car had been abandoned. The timeline didn't match. Jackson dug further, pulling phone records, and it became clear that Carla had been lying. Her phone had pinged off a tower near Sarah's car around the time of her disappearance. The evidence began to stack up. Carla's fingerprints were found on the door handle of Sarah's car, confirming that she had been there. The case was no longer just about Tommy Turner. The investigation had just taken a dark, unexpected turn. As the investigation unfolded, the community's trust in Carla crumbled. People who had known her for years began to question their relationships with her. The woman who had been a comforting presence, who had spoken so gently of love and loss, was now revealed to have been hiding a secret that had torn apart not just her own life, but the life of the Langston family. Jeanette, upon learning the truth, felt a mixture of anger and betrayal. She had trusted Carla implicitly, had confided in her, leaned on her during some of the darkest days of her life. To think that Carla had been sleeping with her estranged husband, and that she had kept this secret for so long, felt like a betrayal beyond words. Even more so, the revelation that Carla's affair with Greg had played a pivotal role in Sarah's death left Jeanette feeling hollow, as though her world had been shattered once again. It wasn't just the loss of Sarah that she had to grieve, but the loss of her trust in the people around her. The town's reaction was one of shock and disbelief. People couldn't reconcile the image of Carla, the compassionate, understanding woman, with the dark truth that had now come to light. As details of the affair and Carla's involvement in Sarah's disappearance surfaced, whispers grew louder. Some people believed that Carla had simply snapped, unable to keep the secret any longer, while others speculated that she had become desperate, fearing Sarah might expose her affair with Greg. For Detective Jackson, the case felt both clearer and more complicated than ever. He had uncovered a motive, but it was one that didn't fully explain everything. Why had Carla acted so recklessly? Why had she allowed things to escalate to the point of murder? And why hadn't Tommy spoken out sooner? As the town prepared for Carla's trial, there was a growing sense that the investigation was far from over. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many people from Carla's past who had yet to be interviewed. Jackson had barely scratched the surface. On the eve of Carla's trial, Jackson received an anonymous tip from an unknown source. The voice on the phone was shaky, barely audible. "You don't know the whole story," the voice said. "There's more. Something bigger than you think. Just wait." Jackson's mind raced. What did this new tip mean? Who else was involved? The case was spiraling in ways he hadn't anticipated, and the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the web of deception was far more tangled than anyone could have imagined. With the trial looming, the mystery surrounding Sarah Langston's disappearance and murder was far from over. The town of St. Bernard had been divided for weeks now, as the truth about Carla Dunn slowly unfurled, like an unraveling thread. The pieces were falling into place, but the more they discovered, the more complicated and twisted the case became. Detective Warren Jackson, standing in his office with the case files spread out before him, felt the weight of each new revelation. Sarah Langston had always been sharp, and in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, she had become increasingly suspicious of the relationship between Carla and her estranged father, Greg Langston. There had been a change in Sarah, a shift from the carefree young woman to someone who was determined to uncover the truth. She had been talking more openly about confronting Carla, about telling her mother the truth. Jackson had learned from Sarah's best friend, Lily, that Sarah had expressed her concerns in the days before her disappearance. "I'm going to find out what's going on between them," Sarah had said. "I don't know what Carla's playing at, but I'll figure it out." Sarah had, unknowingly, stepped into a dangerous game. As Jackson and his team pieced together her movements, it became clear that she had been preparing to expose Carla's affair with her father, something that had been kept hidden for months. And that was the breaking point. Carla had already gone too far to let Sarah's discovery slip into the light. The breakthrough came when Jackson learned that Carla, in a panic over Sarah's growing suspicions, had turned to Tommy Turner for help. Tommy, though emotionally distressed and vulnerable from his breakup with Sarah, had been manipulated by Carla. At first, it seemed like a simple request. Just keep Sarah quiet, prevent her from telling anyone about the affair. But Carla's manipulation of Tommy went deeper than anyone could have imagined. Detective Jackson found that, shortly before Sarah's disappearance, Carla had called Tommy multiple times. The records were clear. She had been trying to get him to meet her. Tommy, despite his reservations, agreed to meet Carla that fateful night. He had been under her control for months, emotionally fragile, guilt-ridden, and desperate for any kind of connection. Carla knew exactly how to exploit that. The details of that night were still murky, but Jackson had gathered enough evidence to know that what followed was nothing short of a calculated act of violence. Carla had used Tommy's guilt against him, convincing him that silencing Sarah would be the only way to save himself from a life filled with shame. She preyed on his deep-seated need to be forgiven, his fear of losing everything, and pushed him further into the darkness. The first twist, the one that had shocked Jackson and the investigation team, came when they discovered the nature of Tommy's involvement. He hadn't just been an unwilling accomplice in the murder of Sarah. No, Tommy had been manipulated, yes, but the more Jackson uncovered, the more he realized the true extent of Carla's influence. Tommy's emotional state had made him easy prey. Carla had known exactly how to twist his loyalty and guilt into a weapon. She made him believe that their shared secret, her affair with Sarah's father, could never come to light. If Sarah had told anyone, the town would never forgive them. Carla played on Tommy's need to feel needed, to feel like he had a purpose beyond his broken relationship with Sarah. It was clear now. Carla had been the puppet master all along. She had not only manipulated Tommy into helping her silence Sarah, but she had also made him believe that the only way out was through violence. Tommy had been caught in her web of lies, guilt, and emotional coercion. Tommy, once a victim in his own right, was now facing the truth about his actions. The guilt that weighed on him was unbearable. Every piece of evidence, every interview, each new detail was pushing him to the edge. The emotional toll was evident in his interviews. He was no longer the tearful ex-boyfriend who had been driven to despair by the end of his relationship with Sarah. Now, he was someone broken, torn between the twisted loyalty he had felt toward Carla and the crushing weight of his own remorse. Jackson watched Tommy's psychological unraveling as the investigation moved forward. He had seen this before, the way guilt twisted a person, making them doubt everything they once knew about themselves. Tommy's breakdowns had become more frequent, his eyes hollow with the weight of his actions. He knew he had been manipulated, but in the end, he had still been the one to pull the trigger. The haunting memory of Sarah's face, her fear, her struggle, followed him wherever he went. Detective Jackson had seen the signs of someone teetering on the edge of their sanity. Tommy's words were jumbled, contradictory, and desperate. "I didn't mean it. I didn't want to hurt her," Tommy had whispered during one of his more emotional interviews. "I didn't, but she knew. She knew too much, and Carla made me." That's when Jackson knew. Tommy was breaking, and it wasn't because of guilt alone. He was realizing that he wasn't just a victim of circumstances. He had been complicit in something that couldn't be undone. And for a man like Tommy, that realization was eating him alive. The second twist came when Jackson uncovered evidence that turned the investigation on its head. Carla wasn't just a passive player in this tragedy. She had been involved in other disappearances, in neighboring towns, cases that had long gone unsolved. The pattern was undeniable. Jackson's team had begun to connect Carla's name to several cold cases, dating back as far as 5 years before Sarah's death. Each case had been dismissed as unrelated, but the details were too similar to ignore. Women, all in their late teens or early 20s, had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Carla's name had never appeared in any of the reports, but Jackson's discovery was chilling. It seemed that Carla had been playing a long game, and Sarah was just one of many pieces she had used to cover her tracks. One name in particular caught Jackson's attention: Emma Grayson. Emma had disappeared in a neighboring town 6 years ago. Her body was never found, but the similarities to Sarah's case were too striking. Both young women had been seen with Carla days before their disappearances. Both had shown signs of having been in a confrontation, and both cases had been quietly dismissed by the local police departments, as if someone had worked behind the scenes to keep them from progressing. Just as Tommy was preparing to stand trial for Sarah's murder, the full extent of Carla's involvement in other disappearances began to surface. Jackson had unearthed disturbing evidence that connected Carla to a series of unsolved cases in the region, each one more chilling than the last. As the town braced for the trial, Jackson knew one thing for certain. Carla's trial was only the beginning. There were far more questions to answer, and the truth was still far from clear. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as Tommy Turner's trial began. The town of St. Bernard, still reeling from the shock of the investigation, watched as the young man, once considered a victim of circumstances, now stood accused of the unthinkable, the murder of Sarah Langston. Tommy, wearing a gray suit that looked ill-fitting on his thin frame, sat at the defense table, his hands trembling as they clasped together in his lap. His face was a mixture of dread and relief, an expression that spoke of guilt and remorse, but also of fear. The defense had painted him as a manipulated accomplice, a man twisted by the emotional hold Carla Dunn had over him. The defense argued that Tommy had acted under duress, his actions not driven by malice, but by a fear of losing everything. And Carla, the puppet master, had exploited that fear to force him into committing a crime that he could never take back. Across the room, Carla sat, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on the proceedings. Unlike Tommy, she wore no expression of vulnerability, only one of calm, controlled indifference. Her fate was all but sealed. Carla had been directly involved in Sarah's murder. The evidence against her was irrefutable: her fingerprints on Sarah's car, her lies about her whereabouts, and the dark secret she had concealed for so long. Carla's role in the affair with Sarah's father and her manipulation of Tommy were laid bare for the world to see. She was guilty, and she knew it. But what was the true nature of her crime? Was she simply a woman who had acted out of fear, or was she a cold, calculating person who had played with the lives of everyone around her to protect her own secrets? The prosecution had painted her as a villain, a woman capable of anything to cover her tracks. The jury, though, had a different perspective, and the trial would reveal whether justice was truly being served, or if it was just a form of revenge for a town that had been wounded too deeply. Jeanette Langston sat in the back of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the proceedings. Her grief had not subsided. In fact, it had only deepened. The faces of the people who had once been part of Sarah's life, friends, acquaintances, even Carla, all seemed to blur into a single, overwhelming image of betrayal. Jeanette had long ago questioned Tommy's innocence, but seeing him here, his face pale and filled with regret, stirred something in her heart. She had watched him break down, heard the panic in his voice, seen the emotional toll his involvement had taken on him. Was he truly guilty, or was he just another victim, another casualty of Carla's manipulation? Jeanette's mind raced with conflicting emotions. She had spent so long mourning Sarah's death, and now she had to reconcile the fact that the very person she had trusted had been complicit in her daughter's murder. Was this justice, or was it simply revenge for the broken trust and the betrayal that had come too late? She turned her gaze to Tommy. He hadn't looked at her once since the trial began. Was he ashamed? Did he even understand the depth of the damage he had caused? Jeanette didn't know anymore. The man who had once been a part of Sarah's life, someone she had welcomed into their home, was now sitting in a courtroom, his future in the hands of a jury. But as much as Jeanette struggled with her feelings of betrayal, she knew the truth. Carla had manipulated Tommy, yes, but Tommy had still played a role. No matter how much he had been under Carla's influence, he had still made the choice to take part in the violence. And for that, there had to be consequences. The trial stretched on for days, the courtroom filled with emotion as both sides made their cases. The defense tried to portray Tommy as someone who had been manipulated, someone who had been led down a path he didn't fully understand. His lawyer argued that Tommy had never intended to kill Sarah. He was a young man, emotionally broken by a bad breakup and a controlling woman who had preyed on his vulnerabilities. The prosecution, however, painted a starkly different picture. They showed the jury the cold, hard facts: Tommy's DNA on Sarah's clothes, the phone records, the witness testimony that placed him at the scene. There was no denying it. Tommy had been involved. Carla's defense was much more straightforward. There was no attempt to paint her as anything other than a woman driven to protect herself. She was guilty, and everyone knew it. The question was not whether she had committed the crime, but whether she would be held accountable for it. When the verdict came, it was a mixture of relief and disappointment. Tommy Turner was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury had agreed that he had not killed Sarah with premeditation, but had acted out of fear and manipulation. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, though with good behavior, he could be eligible for parole in 8. Carla Dunn, on the other hand, was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The weight of her crimes, her emotional manipulation of Tommy, and her direct role in Sarah's murder made it impossible for the jury to show mercy. Was the trial fair? Do you think Tommy got the right sentence? Or should Carla have been punished differently? Let's talk about it in the comments. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the sentences were read aloud. Jeanette, unable to hold back her tears, looked down at the floor. She had her answers, but they didn't bring her peace. Carla's life sentence would not bring Sarah back, and Tommy's prison sentence wouldn't undo the damage he had caused. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But was it enough? As the trial concluded, the emotional fallout became apparent. The town of St. Bernard, once unified in the face of grief, was now splintered. Some believed Tommy had been a victim of manipulation, while others felt betrayed by him. Carla, once a trusted figure in their midst, was now the personification of deceit, and the betrayal of a longtime friend stung deeply. For Jeanette, the aftermath of the trial was even more complicated. She knew that Tommy's conviction was not the end of her journey. There would always be a part of her that wondered if he had been coerced into committing the crime. But the truth was, she would never have the answer she needed. And then, just as Jeanette was beginning to try and find some semblance of peace, a chilling new detail came to light. Detective Jackson received a call from the forensics team. They had uncovered something unexpected, something that sent a chill down his spine. Carla Dunn wasn't done yet. She had been involved in other disappearances, and the evidence was beginning to point to something much darker than anyone had anticipated. The streets of St. Bernard were quiet now, the soft hum of daily life trying to reclaim the peace that had been shattered by Sarah Langston's disappearance. But beneath the surface, a deep unease lingered in the air. The trial was over, the sentences handed down, and the once vibrant community was left to pick up the pieces. Yet, the scars remained, deep, invisible wounds in a town that had once been whole. Jeanette Langston, who had spent years clawing for answers, now found herself faced with a new kind of grief, the absence of answers. She had come to terms with the justice that had been served, but something gnawed at her, something unspeakable, lingering. The truth about Sarah's death had been uncovered, but not all of it. There were still questions that remained unanswered, threads left hanging that no one had the answers to. For Detective Warren Jackson, the weight of the case was no less heavy. The town may have been trying to heal, but for him, the investigation felt incomplete. Tommy had been convicted, Carla had been sentenced to life, but something still gnawed at him. He had uncovered so much, the twisted manipulation, the hidden affairs, the shocking betrayals. But there were cracks in the narrative that never fully aligned. As Jackson sat at his desk, poring over the case files one last time, his mind kept returning to one thing: Sarah's father, Greg Langston. The discovery of Carla's affair had led them down a dark path, but what had been buried even deeper was the mystery surrounding Greg. The more Jackson reviewed the evidence, the more it became clear that Greg's disappearance wasn't a simple abandonment. There were whispers of his involvement in criminal activities in nearby towns, connections to people that no one had ever linked to him before. It was a revelation that made the entire case feel even more tangled, more disturbing. But the truth about Greg Langston would never come to light. The answers, it seemed, were lost to time. The unanswered questions haunted Jackson, and they haunted Jeanette, too. Jeanette stood alone at Sarah's grave, the wind soft against her face as she placed a bouquet of white lilies on the cold stone. The pain in her chest was no less sharp, but there was something softer now, a quiet kind of peace that came from the finality of it all. She had spent years searching, digging through every corner of her life, trying to piece together the puzzle of Sarah's disappearance. And now, the answers were finally in front of her. But peace wasn't always about having all the answers. Sometimes, it was about accepting the unknown. Jeanette whispered into the breeze, as if speaking directly to her daughter. "I found the truth, Sarah. I found the pieces. I just wish there was more." The words lingered in the air, fading with the wind. She had fought for Sarah's memory, for justice, and now, though the pain wasn't gone, she felt a flicker of something else, something like closure. But even as she stood at the edge of the grave, she knew the truth would never be complete. There were pieces of the puzzle that would forever remain missing. Final twist. Jackson stood at the edge of the graveyard, looking at Jeanette from a distance. His thoughts were still on Greg Langston, a figure who had remained shrouded in mystery until the end. Was he part of something larger? The web of secrets and lies didn't stop with Tommy and Carla. There were more stories to be uncovered, more darkness to be revealed. But the answers? They would remain just out of reach, like shadows on the edge of a dream. As Jeanette walked away from Sarah's grave, a single, chilling thought echoed in her mind. The cold case was solved, but the mystery of St. Bernard was far from over. And somewhere, hidden beneath layers of forgotten secrets, more truths awaited to be uncovered. If you've been with me through this whole journey, thank you. Hit subscribe and stay tuned for more stories like this. The mystery of St. Bernard may be over, but new ones are always waiting.